Well, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Samantha Williams, and I work with our community of thought leaders here at Gauge. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, Gauge is a next-gen tech platform that has developed software to help bridge the gap between who brands and are listening and learning from, and bridging the gap between leaders at the forefront of diverse communities to then help them make better, more inclusive decisions. We obviously are here to talk about disability awareness today. Disability Month, Pride Month was back in July. Disability Awareness Month is right around the corner. So today we're just here to dig a little bit deeper on disability awareness, making sure that the disability community is included in every inclusion space. We're thinking about them as we continue to push inclusion movements. I am joined today by Kelsey Lindell, who is a DEI expert and a disability advocate. And I will turn it over to Kelsey just to share a little bit more about herself.
Hi, thanks so much for having me and the nice introduction. My name is Kelsey. I'm a disabled woman. I live in Minneapolis. I've worked as a producer and a marketer. A lot of my public image is more fitness focused because I worked in that space for quite a while. But I've worked in the production and marketing side of things for the last 7 years. And I am very passionate about inclusion because I know the impact that it can have when used for good. So I'm really just pumped about this.
Awesome. Well, we are excited to have you and to really dig in. For the folks who are joining us, we will have some time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop your questions in as we go. You can use either the chat function or the Q&A function, all at the bottom of your screen. So with that, we're just going to go ahead and jump into our very first question. So Kelsey, what role has having a disability played in shaping your identity, and what might that self-identity process, how might that vary from person to person?
Yeah. So, I mean, when I was, for those who don't know much about me, I'm missing part of my left arm. So this is my left arm. It's called a radial club hand, and just means you have two bones in your arm. You have your radius bone and your ulna bone, and I'm missing my radius bone, which causes my arm to be turned in a bit. And I'm also missing some fingers. So when I was growing up, my parents definitely raised me with the mindset of like, you're not disabled, you just have different capabilities. And I think that was actually, even though it was like really well-intentioned, I think it was really harmful because it put this idea in my brain that, oh, I don't want to be disabled. That's something that's bad, or that's something that's not good. And it wasn't until I was working actually in other countries with advocacy organizations, and I saw the lack of like humanity and basic human rights that other people with disabilities in other countries are facing, that I kind of like grappled with, oh my goodness, if I hadn't been born into that family, in that neighborhood, in that society, in that country, my life would be completely different and I would have no rights. And I think that was what really turned a corner for me in like owning the fact that I am a disabled woman, and that's not a bad thing. That's actually a great thing. And disability needs to be celebrated, and disability rights need to be advanced, and disability justice needs to be at the forefront of people's minds.
Right, right. And I think that's such an important point that you make. And I'm being brought back to, I was watching an episode of Say Yes to the Dress a few weeks ago, and the bride who was being featured, she's a nurse on the oncology floor. And she said, whenever I tell people that, they automatically feel bad for me. They look at me with sadness in their eyes. And I say to them, don't feel bad for me. Like, we have a good time here. Like, yes, people are fighting for their lives, but we keep our spirits high. And so I think the point that you make about, you know, when you do meet someone who has a disability, it shouldn't automatically just be, oh, I feel, you know, I pity you, or I feel sorry for you. Really taking the time to speak to the person and figure out like what their story and their journey has actually been. So what do you think are some of the misconceptions that people often have about the disability community that should be taken into consideration, especially as brands embark on various projects, whether it's developing campaigns or products?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot. I think the first is that disability is rare, where it's not. We're rarely included in the way that media and marketing and entertainment portray other minority groups, but we are the largest minority group in the world, and we have the most space for intersection and nuance. So people with disabilities make up 1 in 4 people. Sometimes it's an invisible disability. It could be a physical disability. It could be a temporary disability. It could be a minor disability that people can't really pick up right away, but it's something that impacts their life on a very deep level. Disability is very, very common. 40% of American families have at least one person with a disability in them. That's a lot of people. There are more people with disabilities in the USA than the entire population of Canada. That's a lot of people that we're just leaving out. And people with disabilities only make up 2.3% of the representation in media and marketing. So despite it being 25% of the population, we only make up 2.3%, which is a wild statistic. I think a lot of people believe that disabled people want to be included because we feel left out, which is true to an extent because everyone wants to feel included and wants to feel seen. But the push for inclusion for people with disability is very tied to our civil rights and our human rights, because the ADA has been the law of the land for a really long time, and it's not really doing anything. It's not advancing our rights of employment. It's not advancing any of the things that we are trying to push for as disability advocates in the ways that we thought it would. So it doesn't really matter if something's a law if you can't change society's perception of it. People assume that the disability rights movement was synonymous with other civil rights movements, that it would happen during the 60s and 70s, whereas a lot of the sit-ins and the public demonstrations did happen then, but the ADA wasn't law until the 1990s, which means that I was this close to not being able to go to a public school because I needed special education. So this hand has a slight disability too. I needed occupational therapists every day for years to be able to write. And now a huge part of my work and my livelihood is writing. I needed to be pulled out of my normal mainstream classrooms to be put into special education gym classrooms. And so it's just really interesting that I think of, I was so close not participating in normal schooling because of those things. And it would have been legal for schools to deny me access. And it's not something that happened a long time ago. It's things that it's really recent. And I think the final misconception is that, yes, we need brands to come on board and pull us into inclusion because it's important for our social justice movement. But they also need us. That if 40% of American families have at least one person with a disability, and then people are not just buying with their brains these days or their wallets, they're also buying with their hearts. And we know that 90% of consumers, if there's 2 matching products, they're going to go with the brand that aligns with their core values. So I think it's really important to bear those things in mind, that you're not just doing us a favor. Yes, we need you. You also need us.
Yes. And I think that is, I have found, and even in my own personal experiences, like a Black woman, right? You find that is what people sort of tend to lead with, is like doing a favor. And I think that is something that has to be, it's not doing a favor. It literally, like, we're here and we have a right to be included. So I would love for you to just talk a little bit about ableism and just unpack what that means, why it matters, and just why it poses a danger to inclusion.
Yeah. So ableism, in its most simple definition, is the favor of able-bodied and neurotypical people. So ableism finds its roots in eugenics. The mindset until the 1970s towards people with disabilities was to either prevent them through sterilization. So people with disabilities were often sterilized so that they didn't procreate, to cure them, which often involved unethical means of trying to cure people from their disabilities, including experimental drugs and shock therapy. And if they didn't succeed in those, the next step was to hide them. So to institutionalize them, to not allow them to patronize restaurants or grocery stores. And there was a series of laws that were put into place in the 1800s, like late 1800s, but a lot of them still existed in many ways until the 1970s, and they're referred to as the ugly laws. And they stated that any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or deformed in any way so as to be unsightly or disgusting object to look at, to expose himself or herself to the public view, was illegal. So we couldn't be seen in public in a lot of spaces. And that's horrifying. And these laws were in place until the 1970s in a lot of places. So the history of ableism is rooted in like these horrible laws that were just recently overturned. And in many cases, we're still trying to fight against a lot of these like perceptions and stereotypes because we haven't even been seen by the world for a long time.
Right. And I mean, not being seen, and I think and there are a lot of, there are a lot of instances where, I think that's kind of where it starts, where people have this perception of like being disabled is bad, right? And hiding people in the disability, hiding them away, and it just doesn't, it's not good for anyone. So how can brands start to integrate the sentiment of Disability Awareness Month into their everyday efforts? And you started to touch on this a little bit as you were talking just about employment, but what are some things that brands can be doing to just be addressing and advocating their everyday workspaces?
Yeah. So this year's theme for Disability Awareness and Employment Month is Powered by Inclusion. And typically when I speak to a brand about inclusion, they start to mention their CRGs, and they might reiterate the importance of this to their team internally, which is great. It's a great start. I think one thing that brands can really do to help with advancing the rights and the movement of disability awareness and disability employment is listening to people with disabilities and how we want to be represented. There's 4 common tropes or stereotypes. There's lots of different stereotypes that we're trying to fight against, but there's 4 really common ones, which are the super crip, where we are seen as just incredibly heroic and inspirational by just existing, whereas we just want to be ourselves. There's the villain, where when we're represented in media, it's like something that's like bad or scary or weird. There's the fool, so you think like Forrest Gump, like it's something to kind of be laughed at, or there's somebody to be pitied. And those are 4 most common tropes that disability advocates are really pushing against. And so I think listening to people with disabilities and how we want to be represented and not perpetuating the stereotypes is huge, because like I said before, you can make something a law. The ADA is a law. We're not supposed to be discriminated against, but we are. When you look at the rates of disability employment and the poverty rates are going up and the employment rates are going down. So 17.9% of people with disabilities had a job or were employed in 2020, whereas the previous year it was like 19.4%, I believe. So that went down over the course of like 1 year, when it's the year that we are pushing more than ever for inclusion, and people with disabilities are getting left out.
And so there, kind of to your point here, and we talk about like this like everyday integration. A few months ago, ASOS was, all over the internet for using a model who was hearing impaired, and they showcased her modeling and airing with her implant. And, it broke the internet, as the young kids say. It broke the internet because it wasn't, it wasn't a special day. It wasn't a special month. It was literally just normalizing, like, seeing someone with a disability, not for any reason or for any cause. And I also think that plays a major role in making sure it's having more of those moments, so that it's not a wow factor just because. The same way people like flowers and surprises just because, getting into this mindset of doing it just because, and because it should be happening.
Yeah, totally.
In an ideal world, what is the best way for brands to really support and advocate for the disability community? What does meaningful engagement look like for not only brands, but also just individuals and whatever space that folks are in?
Yeah, so I mean, a huge thing is top down. So education, not just of your C-suite executives, not just of your managers, but everybody needs to have disability sensitivity training, because I'm going to, one of the things that I think is really important is having people with disabilities on your teams and working with people with disabilities to create equitable employment, not just entry level, but you need people with disabilities at the managerial level. You need them at the C-suite level. And how are you going to do that? How are you going to retain those employees if you haven't done the sensitivity training necessary to make sure that the workplace is conducive for that? so I always say top down, like it's an education process. I think also not just assuming that because somebody has a disability, they are willing to advise and consult on your disability strategy. And that they might not be the right person. Like I think about, I was fortunate enough to have had experiences that dealt directly with organizations that were working for justice and the rights of people with disabilities. But until I had that experience, I was definitely of the mindset of like, oh, I'm not really a disabled person. Like I am disabled, but I can pull myself up by the bootstraps. So why can't everyone else? And it wasn't until I was in other cultures with other people experiencing that and then working with people who have been doing disability advocacy work for a really long time and trying to make sure that things were equitable, that I had that mindset shift, right? So I would say also like, make sure you're not just, tokenizing the one person in your team that has a minor disability, that you're working with people who position themselves and have the experience of both the advocacy and the inclusion portions together. I would say avoid tokenism in all its forms and integrate disability into every single shoot, campaign, product launch, employee relation, campaign. Like disability needs to be in all of it, just like every minority group needs to be in all of it. And if there is something that's exclusive to just disability, you need to have disabled people leading that. Because I think a lot of times well-meaning companies and groups will be like, here's our CRG that we created for the disabled people, versus being like, hey, disabled employees, what would you like? How can we support you? So yeah.
No, that's such a good point. And I will even say, like, even in social settings, like as an individual, I have noticed that sometimes there is like this fear of people to talk to someone that has a physical disability that you can see anyway, and it shouldn't. Go and talk and go and speak as you would in anyone else, because the same way that we are here in this space and we are listening and learning together, that very same thing can also be happening when you are out. And well, maybe not when you're shopping, because shopping these days is a very tedious.
We're supposed to be masked and stay 6 feet away.
Yes. But I think that is just one of the most like powerful ways, is to start learning. Yes, of course, go out of your way to really dig in and do the research. But to your point, the disability community, 40%, that's a lot of people. And so we all know someone who is disabled, and we maybe have never even taken the time to talk to them about it, right? It's just as like, yes, we know, and then we move forward, when there's so much to just be learned to then make you a better ally.
Totally.
What are some brands that really stand out to you as ones who are getting it right? And even that term, I hate to use the term getting it right, because it's hard and it's a long journey. But what are some brands that stand out to you that you've just really been proud of the representation and the way that they have worked with the disability community?
Yeah. There's this really awesome athleisure brand called Girlfriend Collective. And it was the first, like, kind of like you were saying, like, we want it to just be normal. We just want disability to be normal, because a quarter of the population has a disability. It needs to be normal. It's not this rare experience. It's super, super normal. And disability is the only minority category that somebody could be born not existing in and end up in, right? Like, an accident could happen in the blink of an eye. You could be a part of our community. So it needs to be normalized. And I just remember the first time I was on their website, somebody just said they had really great products, and I teach yoga and stuff like that. So I went on their website, and there was a woman with Down syndrome that was on there. And it wasn't like, here's our disability month thing. It was just, here's one of our many models. And clearly they value body diversity. There's people of all shapes and sizes. They value gender diversity. There's all genders on there. There's all different races, and then there's also people with disabilities. And I just think it was really beautiful done. It didn't feel like tokenism in any way, because you could tell they really valued disability. And they currently have another campaign out with this beautiful Black model she's missing her entire arm, and they do not hide it. They make it so beautiful, not in your face and like a shocking, we're gonna like lead with this way, but like we're not hiding this. We think this is super cool. I think they're doing a fantastic job in terms of like branding. And then when we want to talk about like kind of top down, I think Adobe is doing really cool things. So they've sponsored, I've seen them just in the space. They've sponsored so many roundtables, Q&As, cohorts of people with disabilities doing very meaningful work. And then they also have something called like their Adobe Stack, where they have a fund and people from all different minorities, including people with disabilities, can apply to create stock footage of how they want to be seen. Because like I was saying, like, these are the four main tropes, and people with disabilities, when they were polled, 80% of us didn't like how we are represented on the 2.3% chance that we are. So that's a big deal. And like we were saying, representation and the way it's done really matters. So to be able to give space to disabled creatives and be like, okay, tell us, show us how it's done, I think is really powerful.
Right. And I want to, as you were saying that, I thought back to probably one of our first conversations together, as we're just thinking about people, brands that are doing a really good job at just like getting it right in representation. But I always remember something that you said. For everyone on the line, Kelsey recently got married. She's a newlywed. But I remember one thing you said to me was people with disabilities are often painted as being asexual or, oh, you can't find love, this sort of thing. And one thing I think that you have done just a really good and transparent job at is you have not once ever, painted your love story in that way. And I think that also can, we can see that kind of tend to happen sometimes as well for different projects. So I just wanted to throw that out there as, you also just kind of being a good example of that. I'm going to pause here for a second. If you have any questions, those who are in the audience, please feel free to start dropping them in the chat or using the Q&A function, and we will get to them in just a moment. But I think the big question here is, with Disability Awareness Month being just a couple of weeks away, what are some immediate steps that brands can take today to just really start engaging, before it's too late and they go too far down the wrong path?
Yeah. So one thing that I've worked with a lot of my partners and clients on has been to use Disability Awareness and Employment Months as an opportunity to put a stake in the ground. So, Disability Pride Month is in July, and I think Disability Pride Month is wonderful and should be celebrated. I think Disability Employment Month or Disability Awareness Month with the focus on employment is much more powerful, because having pride is not going to like shift. We can have all the pride we want until we get employers to take us seriously, until we get brands to take us seriously, until we get the media to take us seriously. We can't have that like big shift. So, I mean, a brand could come out and this like beautiful campaign, but if there's nothing top down, like we were talking about earlier, nothing's going to change internally. We're still going to have, decreasing employment rates when right now we're at 17.9%. Like that's our employment rate. 17.9%. That means over 80% of us are unemployed. Our poverty rates are going to keep rising. And in order to create equity where we can actually fend for ourselves and stand up for ourselves, those numbers got to change. And so I think it's really important to not just do like a one-off campaign, but be like, okay, think about it internally. How can we adjust our hiring practices? How can we adjust, what are the organizations that can help us with that? How can we adjust the way that we talk about disability internally? How do we make sure that people, if and when we hire people with disabilities, like we were saying, how do we make sure they stay employees and feel comfortable voicing their opinion, right? Because a lot of people with disabilities don't always feel comfortable standing up for themselves when it's like a team of all able-bodied people, and they know the chances of them being listened to are, pretty rare. Like I'm sure we'll touch on this a little later, but oftentimes people with disabilities aren't taken seriously because we're viewed as more childlike. There's a huge stereotype that comes with that. So we're not taken seriously a lot. So how are we going to adjust our internal communications? And then also there's the external, like the representation that is incredibly important. But I think in order for a brand to have an equitable campaign that's not just, oh, here's our tokenism, here's our disabled people we're going to put up, to really create change and have that be something that's not just for show and not just, for PR, that really they want to change and want to be an inclusive space. It's going to take some time. You can't even if we had 3 months, you gotta really think about that. So I think Disability Awareness Month is a great time to put a stake in the ground and make a plan. And think about what are the systems we need to put in place, what are the organizations we need to contact, and what's the accountability that we're going to have for this. So I think that's the best way that brands can kind of gear up for Disability Awareness Month, with the focus on employment in October. And then also, Disability Awareness Month is a great time to include people with disabilities, obviously, but so is all year long. Yes. And just like it would be ridiculous if the only time a brand included Black people was in February, or gay people, LGBTQIA people was in June. It needs to be all year round. And that same sentiment needs to go for people with disabilities too.
Right, totally. And it's, well, not the fact that you say that, that was one thing. We had a Pride event back in May, and that was one of the things that our panelists touched upon is, you know, Pride Month rolls around and you are booked and busy to the max. And then, you know, the other 11 months, it's like waiting on calls or having to reach out. And so that, I think, is just really a key piece in making sure that it's consistent and it can go beyond, you know, that month. The same way I shout from the mountaintops that Black people can be celebrated outside of Black History Month.
Totally.
It can be, you know, beyond that. Go ahead, Kelsey, you were about to say.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's just also like, I think we also need to consider, like, just like, you know, October's Disability Awareness Month with a focus on employment. I think brands sometimes forget that, like, there's so much opportunity for intersectionality. So within that, there are lots of Black disabled people. There are lots of LGBTQIA plus community members that are also disabled people. And I think it's really important to remember that, because even when you look at like how the ADA was passed and a lot of those sit-ins and the big demonstrations of people with disabilities, the intersectionality was always a part of it. Like the Black Panthers were the people that fed the disabled people that did the sit-in in San Francisco. Like, we would not have this law without the codependence on each other, and all of our liberation is tied together.
Yes, I love that. And it's so true. And I think that that is something that we don't speak enough about. I think sometimes there's a tendency to look at movements as just being very separate, when really that, just the way that it's integrated it counts for so much, especially as the way that we move forward in these movements. I want to hear from you. You know, we kind of talked about the ways that brands can get this right. I want to hear from you. What are just some watch outs, right? Like, what are some scenarios of where folks have maybe missed the mark, but something for other people to, you know, learn from in that?
Yeah. So, okay. There's a TV show that my husband and I just stumbled across it. Like, it was honestly, never heard of it in our lives. We were on Netflix and we stumbled across this show and we were like, this is like recommended for us. I've never heard of it. Let's try it. And the main character is blind, and it's like an action show, kind of like a crime show. It's fantastic. It's an incredible show. And we got super into it. I think we like binged it in a weekend. And we're so excited for the new season to come out. And then the new season is currently out and we're watching it. And there's this episode where the main character, her friends like trick her into doing something that is like objectively good for her, but they do it by using her blindness against her. And she gives this amazing monologue, and it brought tears in my eyes, and it just made me feel so seen as a person with a disability, because she talks about how her friends had never made her feel like a person with a disability in her life until then, and all of her life she's just felt like siloed into just being a person with a disability by everyone except these friends. And I mean, it was amazing. And as a person with a disability, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel this so much. I feel this by society. And I feel like sometimes like these like core friends that I have are the only ones that don't do that to me. And I looked it up, and the actress is not blind. And it just went from like this incredible, powerful moment, because the show depicts this character as like multifaceted, somebody who's not asexual, somebody who the plot would not be the same without, somebody who has friends, somebody who is likable, but also isn't, because I think a lot of times people with disabilities were portrayed as like, oh, cute, that cute disabled person over there. It was like this multifaceted character. It was so well written, and they lost it. by not having it be played by a disabled person. And you think about like so many people with disabilities are fighting so hard just to be seen. And I think of all of the disabled actresses that would have loved that role, who that role would have changed their life. And they could have taken that to then go do more advocacy and more awareness. And it just stopped there. And it was such a disappointment, because it's like, it was such a bummer. And then I guess another example is, I went to a fashion event for Fashion Week, and it was put on by all able-bodied women and models. And this is actually the second time they've done it. And I know the people behind it. And so I sent them a message after the first time. I was like, hey, can I give you some feedback as a disabled person about this event? Because it was a disability-centric fashion event. So it was only people with disabilities there, and no one else, was involved in terms of like the models. And so I give them some feedback initially that this actually wasn't inclusive. This was secluded. So it was people with disabilities, and they were included in like fashion, I guess, but it was also like, a 20-minute drive or more away from where everything else was. It wasn't downtown with all the cool things. It was, when you think about disability accessibility, this was over 60 minutes away by a bus, which is the primary, like public transportation is the primary mode of transportation for people with disabilities. That wasn't accessible. There was no sign language interpreter. And this is the second time they did it, and they didn't learn from it. And it was all run by able-bodied people. And they didn't realize that they had perpetuated those like ugly laws of like the seclusion, like you can't be seen by everyone else, that like they're put far away from everything else. It wasn't promoted the same way. There was no hair and makeup teams there. There was no live music like there are at all of the other shows. The only people there were the families of the people with disabilities, and it was half children, which then perpetuates that idea that we're talking about of like, people viewing people with disabilities, especially atypical neurological disabilities, they view them as childlike. And then that's how people with disabilities end up in these really abusive conservatorships, and because of these like mindsets. And it was just disheartening, because I know none of those people that put on that event wanted to harm people with disabilities, but by not listening and not understanding the context and not having anybody with a disability on their team, their well intentions ended up harming a lot of the movements that people with disabilities are trying really hard to eradicate. So, yeah.
And I think, the big thing there, and it just goes back to this conversation around representation in all ways. And again, we touched on this in the conversation we had around Pride, where oftentimes there will be folks cast in a role who don't belong to the LGBTQ plus community. And yet there are plenty of actors out there who would have loved and crushed the role, who can identify even more. I want to shed a spotlight on what are some organizations that you think are just doing really awesome work in the disability space that folks can support and turn to, just to continue to learn more and do more with.
Yeah. So I know some of their representation is here. There's a group here locally that I have come to know and love, that they're called Inclusive Networking, and their whole focus is not just getting people with disabilities into jobs, which is important. They want to get them into like those like managerial or higher jobs so that they can have more impact. And I think that's really powerful. So I really like what they're doing. I think that and they introduced me to the concept of like the Valuable 500, which is Fortune 500 companies that say that they want to employ people with disabilities at those different levels. So I think that organization is doing a lot of really cool things too. In terms of representation, I also think, a lot of, like before this, you and I were talking about a lot of the organizations that have been around for a long time. There are a lot of really great organizations that have been around for a long time. There are also a lot of organizations that have been around for a long time that are run by able-bodied people. And a lot of times it's these able-bodied people have proximity with disability. They either have a child with a disability, a sibling with a disability, something along those lines. And I think a lot of times people who have close proximity with disability value their own experiences more than disabled people. So I would just highly recommend, when doing your research, ask who's behind it, and if there are people with disabilities employed there, because there's just nothing that's going to be more valuable in terms of helping brands or organizations see how disability discrimination happens and how to work against it, and how the types of narratives that they're telling about people with disabilities can be improved, than people who have experienced the discrimination firsthand. Like in the last year and within the last 6 months, like I have had the R word used at me. Like this is not something that's like super far in the past. Like this is something that happens now, and somebody who just has proximity disability could never tell you how that feels the way that I could.
Right.
So I just think it's really important that when you're doing this, it's important to listen. And also, like, this is something that I tell everyone that I work with, and why I'm in the process of like building a cohort of lots of people with disabilities from lots of different backgrounds, because my experience, like I mentioned at the beginning, my parents kind of raised me with this mindset of like, you can do anything, and like, you're not really disabled and whatever. And because of that, and because, my dad had a job that had good health insurance and my mom could stay home with me, I was able to have all of the things I need to provide for me, so I could, quote unquote, pull myself up by my bootstraps, right? Like I could have 11 surgeries before I was 6 because my parents could afford that, and they could take care of me, and they could go to the appointments and go to the post-op appointments, and they could hire, even if my school hadn't had occupational therapists, they could have hired someone potentially. But that's not the case for everyone.
Right.
That's a very privileged stance, and I know that. And so I think it's really important that whenever I work with somebody, I'm like, don't just listen to me. You also need to listen to Black people with disabilities. You need to listen to people with, intellectual disabilities. You need to be listening to people who have different socioeconomic backgrounds, because just because something was how I experienced it, that's not how everyone experiences it. Like when we're talking about a quarter of the population, there's a lot of nuance in there. That intersectionality is important in terms of like race and gender and sexuality. Those are important factors, but so is socioeconomic. That kind of intersection is really important, as well as like religion is important and how that plays into how people view their disability. There's so much nuance there. And so I say, don't just listen to one person, like put people together and let them come together and help them, make a more informed decision, because other people from other intersectionalities don't have the same experience I have, and I don't have the experience I have, and we all need each other.
And I mean, I think that just ties into, and we were talking about this earlier, but avoiding that just like the one size fits all sort of approach. Everyone's experience is different. Everyone's path and their journey to even being proud of their disability is different, right? Not everyone starts off in that space, and some people have to grow into that. So, I mean, I am super excited to see what you do with this cohort. We have a question from the audience from Pastor Deborah. Essentially, the question is, a lot of times you will see different corporations hiring employees with disabilities, but what are things that people can be doing to make sure that these employees are being treated fairly? Pastor Deborah says right now she kind of feels like she's the watchdog over those employees. But what are other things that folks can be doing to help?
There are a lot of really awesome HR organizations that help kind of do an audit internally of like, is this an accessible employment? I would say make sure that they are getting paid the same as non-disabled people. That's a huge, pay discrimination is massive. And actually did you know it's actually legal to pay people with intellectual disabilities less than minimum wage? That's still legal in lots of states. So looking out for basic things like that is huge. I am not an HR specialist. That is not my background, but there are a lot of organizations, and I can provide you with a list of some. I know the fact is mind blowing. I know it's sickening. It's horrible. So there's a lot of work. That's why I believe that Disability Awareness Month in terms of employment is more important than just Disability Pride Month, because it's one thing to have pride. It's another to have equal rights. So I would say work with organizations that are led by people with disabilities, that they're going to have better insight into the different types of ways that you can make your workplace more equitable. It was one thing that you and I were talking about beforehand too, is COVID has been really interesting because people with disabilities have been begging for remote work options for years, and no one took us seriously. But as soon as it affected able-bodied people, everyone could figure out how to work from home.
Right.
We were told it was too expensive. We were told that it was going to take too much work, that the job couldn't be done from home. And now we're finding out that was all BS. So there's a lot of organizations that are doing good work. That's not my focus, but I partner with a lot of organizations that do that. So I'm happy to give some resources.
I would also say it's just a general thing, and we talked about this also. Think about what really helps to make you successful in your job, the things that you find to be incredibly convenient and just make your workspace better, make you more productive, and make sure that the same is true for someone with a disability. And I always think it's just like a good kind of grounding point, as making sure that it's right and all is well. We're going to close out in just a moment, but Kelsey, please tell folks how they continue to follow you, keep up with the work that you're doing.
I would say the best option would be LinkedIn. I know I sent Sam the link for the cohort that we're going to be or that we are going to be opening for October. I'm super excited about it. We've got a lot of awesome speakers, a lot of awesome courses about the background, about disability discrimination, ableism, the disability rights movement, how we're perpetuated in society, or how stereotypes are perpetuated in society, and then also like how to impact these things. And I would say you can follow me on Instagram if you want. It's mostly fitness stuff, but and then also it's like a fan page for my husband. But I think that LinkedIn would probably be the best way to keep in touch with me and keep involved with all the activism work that I do.
Yes. Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with
Thank
us.
you for having me.
And being so open and transparent to make sure that we can have this conversation. If you all would like to keep up with the work that is happening at Gage, if you are interested in becoming a Gager, someone who can weigh in on different topics and moments like this, impacting communities that you care about, please head over to gage.ai. I'm going to say that one more time, gage.ai. To become a Gager. Thank you all so much for your time, and we will talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.